Hey all, here OS Reviews. So a couple of days ago, Sony unveiled their Xperia 1 Mark 7, the 7th generation model of their flagship Xperia 1 line here in 2025. And I actually thought it might be an interesting moment to revisit one of their older devices, the Xperia 5 Mark 2, aka 2nd generation model, see how it's holding up 5 years later, since this phone was released in 2020. Now, one of the reasons why I am kind of interested in this device is because the Xperia 5 line was always supposed to be the more compact sibling to the Xperia 1, which is a taller device, having a 6.5-inch screen compared to the 6-inch panel of the Xperia 5 series. It's actually more of a spiritual successor to their true compact series phones from back in the day. And even though it's a little bit taller, the width was actually quite comparable, making it easy to hold with one hand, especially for folks with smaller hands or want a device that's easier to pocket. It actually had a pretty special position. But unfortunately, as of 2023, the Xperia 5 Gen 5 was basically the last revision in this more compact line. And it's been 2 years now, Sony haven't really unveiled any plans to come out with a newer Xperia 5 device, much to the dismay of compact phone enthusiasts. Unfortunately, I think Apple is also going the same way, with the iPhone mini being discontinued for a couple of years as well. It seems like screen sizes are just getting larger and larger. And so at this point, there's 5 iterations of the Xperia 5 phones to pick between. And I would say the 2nd generation model is where Sony really started to find their stride in terms of the specs being a significant upgrade compared to the 1st generation, in my opinion. For example, the screen's refresh rate went from a standard 60 Hz all the way up to 120 Hz suddenly on the 2nd gen, a pretty big jump, so it feels more fluid than ever. The processor was bumped up from a Snapdragon 855 to an 865 with 5G support. The camera lens, at least the hardware, got significantly better as well. The primary sensor went from a rather small 1/2.55 inch to a 1/1.7 inch, so it now is capable of capturing a little bit more bokeh. It also introduced the Zeiss T-Star coating, although one can argue this might be more of a licensing or branding play. But nonetheless, it did feel like a pretty substantial upgrade in terms of speed as well as fluidity, thanks to increased RAM as well, going from 6 gigs to 8 gigs one generation later. So I would say the 2nd generation model onwards felt more polished and refined than ever before. Not to mention, perhaps the biggest improvement was in battery endurance. It went from a rather small 3000 mAh capacity on the original Gen 1 to now a 4000 mAh capacity pack on the 2nd generation revision. So for a relatively compact size phone, it actually meant that the device could now last more comfortably through an entire day, day and a half before you had to recharge it again. So I did think it was a better performer all around. Now, unfortunately though, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, despite the fact that I do really adore and love Sony devices just because they are rather unusual and quirky in the landscape of phones, particularly with their aspect ratio, which insists on being super tall and skinny at 21:9. It's quite cinematic. It does make the device more comfortable to grip and offers an interesting alternative, a little bit different looking compared to most other maybe 18 or 19:9 aspect ratios being just a bit more common, making the overall dimensions wider. So even though Sony smartphones aren't really mainstream anymore, at least they offered something a little bit different. Unfortunately though, as we can see immediately when the screen turns on, there is a kind of critical hardware issue with the display that was employed on the Xperia 5 Mark II. In fact, all the way up to the Xperia 5 Mark IV, based on my understanding, all developed a similar symptom of a green and pink line running across the screen that is almost inevitable. It's just a matter of time before they start cropping up. And it isn't a user error or handling flaw because it's a widespread issue that Sony later admitted to, which is honestly quite a shame, and akin to the lantern or lightsaber that we have here on the edge of our desk, leaves it with a pretty distracting line over the screen, which is also why I think it's important to have these revisited longer-term reviews instead of only using a product for, say, a few days or a week. Some of these hardware and quality control issues only pop up a couple of months later. So this is definitely something to be aware of, and actually a little concerning because although there are discussions of this issue on sites like Reddit, different forums, but on YouTube, for example, there's actually very little coverage. I mean, on one hand, maybe it's because the popularity of Sony phones have become rather niche. They're not as mainstream as Samsung's or iPhones, so perhaps they have less eyes and attention on them. But for whatever reason, I do think this is something that's worth discussing and also bringing to life for those possibly considering this particular device. And although it's easy to point fingers and say it's Sony's fault, if we dig a little deeper, this is actually Samsung's issue because Sony sourced the display. It was manufactured by Samsung. It was a defective batch of OLED panels through Samsung's fabrication around 2020 and affected all of the flagship smartphones from this era, including Samsung's own Galaxy S20 series, the OnePlus 8, unfortunately all developed a similar symptom, although it seems like the occurrence on the Xperia 5 for some reason was a little bit higher than these other devices, which is why if you go to sites like eBay and sort by lowest price, you can see that almost all of these listings had the same issue of that lightsaber green line showing up on the Xperia Mark V's display, which is also why the price of this particular revision has dropped quite significantly, especially for a Sony smartphone that does tend to retain their value a little bit higher compared to many other brands. Likely because of their scarcity, it's a bit more rare, but in the case of the Xperia 5 Mark II, you can see that this particular defect is definitely influencing the resale value, and now it's falling into super budget territory, but obviously with a screen defect. And again, searching for this issue, we can see all of the discussion basically on Reddit and not really being shown to the wider public through channels here like YouTube. So just something to keep in mind. And something I do find to be kind of funny, maybe in a sad way, is Sony users are so loyal and forgiving. For example, this particular thread where the comments are kind of hilarious, saying, "Welcome to the club," other commenters comparing it to a lightsaber or even a lighter, or just saying, "Oh well, it's a bummer," and just kind of moving on. It seems like everyone's tone is just so kind and forgiving, but in my opinion, it's kind of ridiculous because you're spending hundreds of dollars on a flagship grade smartphone, and this to me seems like a pretty serious defect that, in my opinion, Samsung should be held responsible for. I mean, it's kind of crazy that due to poor quality control on their manufacturing, they've basically destroyed an entire generation or era of smartphones. Now, if you're buying older models, you have to keep in mind that devices manufactured in this specific year using a Samsung panel likely will have that issue coming up. It just makes the entire shopping process a little bit more complicated and tedious. And I don't want to harp on Samsung too much either because they definitely have created rather cool devices in the past I've enjoyed, but it does seem like their QA and defect rate in general is just a little higher than what might be normal. For example, there was the whole exploding battery fiasco on the Note 7 a few years ago, and even on their non-exploding phones, it seems like the defect rate of the batteries swelling up over time seems to occur at a higher rate compared to many other manufacturers. In fact, this is a known problem that other YouTubers like MKBHD have also talked about on their collection of older generation phones. Many swollen batteries all seem to point at this one particular brand. Or some of you guys may remember that Samsung tried to create a premium Chromebook a couple of years ago, one of their first more luxurious laptops, and unfortunately another issue cropped up a couple of months down the road where the computer overheats and then it makes the touchpad as well as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth non-responsive. It was a widespread issue. Imagine paying over $1,000 for a computer that has a mouse that just sporadically doesn't work. Although some customers have speculated it's due to static electricity buildup because Samsung didn't add any copper or insulating pads inside of the touchpad layer. So some folks claim that you could fix it by taking it apart and adding some tape underneath the trackpad. And then of course Samsung creates many appliances, including refrigerators, that have also had some concerning reports recently. In fact, a class action lawsuit, I believe, because their refrigerators keep on leaking water due to another design flaw on some of their earlier refrigerator models. I mean, at this point, it's kind of getting ridiculous. It's almost a game of Russian roulette. However, you get the idea. The general defect rate across the board when it comes to displays, batteries, all these different components do seem to be failing at a higher speed than expected. Perhaps some of that is planned obsolescence because they want you to upgrade to the newest devices, making the hardware purposefully last shorter. And so despite having a very glitzy, polished, beautiful exterior, oftentimes the longer term use starts to have a couple of problems cropping up. I mean, imagine if this was any other company, like for example, HTC or even poor LG. Some of these brands have been literally bullied out of this industry. And in my humble opinion, they haven't done anything as egregious. Imagine if they wreaked havoc on the entire industry with defective batches of screens or batteries. They probably would have been wiped out of existence even sooner. But with Samsung, I think it's kind of a common tendency that we have to just shrug it off and say, oh well, and move on, kind of just forgetting about it. But honestly, I think people's patience and their good graces will run out at some point, especially if some of these issues that could have been fixed with better quality control continue to happen again and again. I think it's only a matter of time. Oh, something else I forgot to mention would be Samsung's cameras. Now, of course, this is a space that they have since left, but another issue that starts to crop up recently is many of their older digicams often have failing sensors on them, distorting the screen. So if you look up certain, for example, Samsung NV digital cameras, they will often just produce completely unusable results. So if this was an isolated incident and it only happened maybe once or twice, I probably wouldn't even bring it up, but I'm just kind of feeling frustrated for them because it keeps on occurring across these different sectors, and now it's ruining not only their own devices, but bleeding over, affecting the entire industry and generation of products that are using their components inside. Like poor Sony over here that's already having a difficult time when it comes to market share, and this certainly does not help. So yeah, I don't want to digress too much into just a Samsung rant, but clearly they're sitting pretty. At this point, many of their competitors have been squished out or just no longer exist, and so they're getting away with many more of these aspects that they probably wouldn't have been able to do just 10, 20 years ago, literally receiving funding and sponsorships from the US government. And the way they act also seems highly inappropriate. I think will rub plenty of people off the wrong way. For example, they will strike down videos if you're being too critical of them on the grounds of copyright claims, which is just false and incorrect, while at the same time, they make products like the Samsung Galaxy Watch Ultra, which is clearly derived from Apple Watch Ultra. It just gives off the feeling of someone that doesn't practice what they preach. I mean, imagine being a multi-billion-dollar company and being salty that someone had something critical to say on one of their products, giving an honest review. And we could probably spin this out into a whole separate video of all the hilarious things that this company has done to kind of silence, bully, intimidate the industry, and for some reason still get away without any repercussions. Because now, aside from quality control issues, you've gone into the realm of having behavioral and ethical issues as well, basically using tactics like censorship to illegally silence commentary that doesn't go your way. Anyways, we've given more than enough time to Samsung. Returning back to the Xperia 5 Mark II, the device comes in pretty attractive shades, including blue, even a pink version. More conventional shades of silver and black could also be found. Closer look at the design, bottom features the Type-C port, which also has video display output capability as well if you have external monitors that you want to connect it to, and it charges the phone up at 21 watts. Not bad, filling up the capacity in just a little over an hour. There are built-in stereo speakers, and as a flagship phone, it's unsurprising that it comes with IP68 water resistance and dust-proof rating, making it a little more durable. Now, speaking of the camera setup here, aside from that primary lens with a larger sensor size, there's also a 3x telephoto zoom lens, as well as a 125-degree ultra-wide-angle lens that composes of the setup, making it pretty versatile. We also have a LED flash here on the top, and of course, all the typical connectivity options, including Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, NFC, can all be found, again, like most other flagship phones. Located on the right-hand spine, there's also access to a dedicated camera shutter key, making it easy to jump into the camera just by long holding for an extra second, half press to focus, and then all the way down to snap a shot, similar to a dedicated point-and-shoot camera for added ergonomics. There's also a power key, which is the fingerprint scanner. However, it's actually quite responsive and fast in my testing. Just putting your finger there unlocks in just a split second. There's also a volume rocker. Again, all the frames and edges of the device are crafted out of aluminum alloy, feeling quite premium and robust. in addition to a dedicated Google Assistant key. Now, hear me out. Back in the day, Google Assistant wasn't widely loved, and having a dedicated hardware key that couldn't really be remapped was kind of a critical aspect of the phone's design. But these days, Google Assistant has now been merged with Gemini. Using the large language model, it's actually become a lot more intelligent and actually useful. So having it accessible with one click actually is a theme that's coming back around with some of the latest iPhones, for example, and even dedicated AI gadgets like the Rabbit R1. So this was kind of forward thinking in a way, and it's become more powerful now that the phone has been updated with newer Google models, including Gemini. Up top, we have a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. That's a relic of the past that is really rare to see in this day and age, and actually great because even on older Sony Xperia compact phones like this XZ2 Compact actually got rid of the headphone jack. But due to popular demand, Sony actually listened to their customers and popped it back on here. So you can use this for more hi-fi audio listening if you don't want to use wireless Bluetooth while still preserving the dust and water resistance, which is quite impressive. On the side here is also going to be the hybrid nano SIM card plus micro SD card slot, expanding on the built-in memory, and depending on the configuration, it came with either 128 or 256 gigabytes built on in, again coupled with 8 gigs of RAM. I think these are all still quite competitive specs, honestly speaking, even in 2025 standards. At least from a performance perspective, the phone still feels incredibly snappy, responsive, and smooth. Also helped with that, again, 120Hz refresh rate for the OLED HDR-enabled touchscreen panel, which also doesn't have any cutouts or interruptions of any kind. There is a smaller bezel here on the very top as well as bottom that comprises of the earpiece as well as the 8-megapixel front-facing camera, leaving the screen itself completely uninterrupted. The phone can be upgraded up to Android 12 and it has Sony's kind of Xperia launcher or skin on top of Android, but it isn't a super intrusive layer in my opinion. There's still access to the Google Newsfeed here on the side. You can still swipe down since it's a pretty tall phone to have access to your typical shortcuts for wireless connectivity, and as a flagship, the haptic vibration motor also feels incredibly tight and satisfying. Although for a glass sandwich design, one notable omission here would be Qi wireless charging support is unfortunately not found on this second generation revision. Now, in terms of built-in apps, it kind of depends on the version of the phone you pick up. If it's a Japanese version that has been on carriers like au, for example, or SoftBank, you'll find a handful of those carrier exclusives. But fortunately, many of these can be disabled or deleted, including built-in LinkedIn. As you can tell, there are a handful of bloatware. However, if you get the international unlocked version, it should be a little bit cleaner. So it might take you a couple of minutes to do some cleanup work, depending on if you're using all of these pre-installed apps and services like Instagram, Twitter, so on and so forth that you see here. Sony also sprinkles in a couple of their own custom apps, including the PlayStation app. So if you have a PlayStation console, you can have some remote play capabilities through the phone, which is pretty cool. Also taking advantage of the excellent haptic vibration motor there to add a bit more of that sensory experience. Sony also adds in their own music player app. Although it's relatively simple, it's still a callback to the days of their Walkman music players, giving you ability to sort by album, artist, genre. Otherwise, you'll find some dedicated camera apps from Sony. And just like the Xperia 1 series, they're separated into 3 different apps, which might be a little confusing at first, but you'll get the hang of it once you start using it. So the first regular camera app is basically their auto mode. This is a more traditional layout, giving you access to functions like HDR. There's also a portrait kind of bokeh mode that you can activate, as well as easily swapping between the primary, the 3x optical zoom lens, as well as the ultra wide angle lens. You can see how that will adapt accordingly. And all 3 of these camera lenses on the rear are 12 megapixels. So the resolution actually remains consistent, which is pretty cool compared to on budget phones, for example, which likely has a inferior quality camera on the ultra wide or telephoto. But on Sony's flagship phones, they try to make it a little bit more even, although the primary lens still has the largest sensor for letting in more light. You can also flip into video recording mode, as well as an ultra slow motion mode here as well. And for video capture, you can also turn on HDR for added boost in terms of contrast and also when you're in more difficult lighting environments. Mode key allows us to activate a panoramic mode. There's also a Google Lens for scanning in documents and objects, as well as a creative effect mode that will allow you to apply certain filters, for example, boosting the contrast or saturation, as well as simulating kind of a film effect, as you can tell there, to further play around with instead of editing it in post. With a couple of additional settings here for changing the resolution, as well as focus, skin softening, things like that can also be played around with here under more advanced settings. The camera app, of course, has tap to focus, where you can also further change properties like the white balance, exposure levels, and it's otherwise just kind of recognizing whatever you're pointing at. For example, a person versus macro, you see kind of that intelligent auto scene recognition pop up down below there, just like on their CyberShot dedicated digital cameras. However, if you want more granular control, that's where you can pop into the second Photo Pro app. The interface here is going to even more closely resemble something like a Sony RX100, giving you more of the manual control. For example, you can see a live histogram view if you're preserving enough details within your shots or blowing anything out. You can also see the aperture, which starts at f1.7, so relatively fast and bright for that primary lens, as well as, again, switching between those three lenses and millimeter focal length equivalents can also be shown here with a more professional looking layout. So it's clear that Sony has a little bit more ambitions, also catering towards content creators and enthusiasts looking for more advanced control built on in. You can also see on top here the amount of memory that is remaining, and here on the side we're able to control properties like if you want to shoot in RAW or if you want to shoot in JPEG. So plenty of tools at your disposal that are trying to emulate a real digital camera experience with more of these manual controls. In fact, if we tap here, we can go into a program priority, a shutter priority, or a full manual mode. This will activate even more controls here, like the shutter speed that you can change, the manual focus capability, giving you a dial here to get more in and out of focus. And then there's Cinema Pro, which is that equivalent pro mode for video recording, taking advantage of the ultra-wide 21:9 aspect ratio, which is cinematic and IMAX-like, instead of using 16:9 in the regular camera app. Again, there's plenty of manual controls here, including even some scenes or filter effects that you can apply as you're recording video for changing the color temperature, even a monochrome black and white mode that can be triggered. Quite fun to play around with, as well as changing the white balance through presets or a custom slider down below here as well. So it is very feature stacked. In fact, the ultra-wide aspect ratio features built-in microphones on both the top as well as the bottom of the phone. So it captures in stereo, and you can see if the audio levels are skewed to one side or the other. In fact, there's even a focus bracketing function where you can make the video footage become a little bit blurry and then slowly get into focus using the dials over here, as well as the frame rate can be set at a more cinematic 24 FPS as well. As for image quality and performance, I would say you can definitely tell that the lens is quite sharp, and because of the slightly larger sensor size versus past generations, there's a bit more of that natural bokeh separating the background from the part that's in focus. Actually looking quite good if you are zooming in. Color science remains quite natural without it being too overly saturated, while still looking quite attractive as you're cropping and zooming in. Also, there is a macro mode that you can activate using the ultra-wide angle lens. The setup here gives you plenty of versatility. That being said, when it comes to the camera processing, at least in the auto mode, I still think that this is an area where Sony software has some room for improvement. Now, we've been saying this for a while now, but despite having amazing manual control mode for more pro photographers, the intelligent auto mode is an area where, for some reason, Sony always seems to lag maybe a half step behind some of the other manufacturers, whether it is Samsung or a Google Pixel device, often providing more mature processing, especially when you are shooting in darker environments. The night mode per se is not quite as strong on the Xperia 5 Mark II. We'll see an example in a moment, but in well-lit conditions, it still gives you a pretty nice looking result. By the way, this is the 3x optical zoom, getting closer to this little lamp post here versus the regular and also the ultra-wide angle lens. Impressively, lens distortion is handled quite well, so it doesn't seem to curve off too dramatically at the edges, despite fitting more within the frame of the shot. So yeah, overall, I would say it's definitely a quality camera, especially the hardware that Sony uses always seems to be flagship grade for the time. Not too surprising because many other companies, including, ironically enough, Samsung in this case, iPhones as well, all seem to source the camera components, sensors from Sony. So it's no secret that Sony's hardware engineering team is always cutting edge. Sometimes it's just their software that needs to play catch up to better optimize the components that they've selected. For example, again, this is the night mode. You can tell how it is, of course, very challenging because it's almost completely dark, but the textures of the tree here, for example, are not really getting captured as well compared to on a Google Pixel phone, for example, with night sight, would really increase the exposure time, giving giving us a brighter image, as well as using computational photography. So I would say the low light performance just struggles a little bit more, mainly down to the camera processing, as well as the software could still use a little bit of improvement there. Sony should probably invest more in their software division going forward. But in their own way, Sony is quite a stubborn brand, which is obviously evidenced by their insistence on using these ultra-wide aspect ratio screens, so it's not too surprising. But again, fingers crossed this is an area they continue to refine, because as good as the manual mode is, sometimes you just want to snap a quick photo, and having it perform more consistently in that auto mode for folks wanting that simplicity would be nice to find. But anyways, in daytime, it still captures excellent looking photos overall. In fact, really just ending this on a couple of final images of flowers here. Again, the sharpness and detail all looking quite good. Same really goes when it comes to the color science. It is more than satisfactory. Again, not too surprising considering this is a previous flagship grade smartphone, so as long as there's sufficient lighting, or if you're a bit more adventurous and comfortable playing around with the manual controls, then this is still a camera that you can squeeze out plenty of impressive results and performance from. Again, getting you a little closer to nature photography purposes as well. One other tip I wanted to share from other folks that unfortunately also developed the green line issue would be playing around with the wallpapers, and there's plenty of quite attractive looking photography results from Sony that takes advantage of the OLED nature, making the colors really vibrant and pop. The funny thing is you can also download some Star Wars lightsaber inspired wallpapers like this one here, making it look like this line is almost half intentional as part of the design running across the screen, kind of masking it, but then again, still a bit of a sad situation overall. Sony also has a multi-window switch tab here, which allows you to instantly jump between two of your favorited applications. For example, you can watch videos while browsing the web. Actually not bad, and because of the Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 processor remains a beast even in 2025 standards, the phone remains cool in operation and still quite fast and performant. We can better illustrate this with a quick web browsing test, jumping into a page like The Verge, which is rather complex. We can even load the full desktop version of the site, plenty of videos and ads, and you can just tell how the phone still seems to fly, feeling very zippy and almost instantaneous as you're swiping around. Nothing feels too slow or choppy at all. Plus the 8 gigs of RAM ensures that you're able to still open up at least a dozen tabs in the background and jump back and forth. Things remain still quite fast and fluid. And also in terms of reception quality, the embedded antenna lines seem to be quite strong with both Wi-Fi and 5G connectivity here in the US. So making calls, staying connected is generally not a problem. Now moving into a quick demo of video playback and the built-in speakers. Takeaway is the built-in stereo speakers are actually quite immersive. There's one on the top, one at the bottom, giving you plenty of separation with the wider aspect ratio of the screen. And also there is the aforementioned kind of unique dynamic vibration mode that also uses the excellent haptics to slightly buzz and vibrate whenever there's a drum beat, for example, in the song, adding a little bit more to the impact. It might not be a feature that's practical in every case, but it almost gives you the illusion that the bass is even stronger if you want to play around with it. Of course, remains quite fluid and fast, similar to what we mentioned before, thanks to the processor as well as the RAM combination underneath the hood. Furthermore, swiping up for the multitasking tray also allows you to bring up a pop-up window view. So certain apps, including the calculator, for example, can have a mini app that you can resize and then float around the main screen as you're performing other tasks. For example, maybe looking at a Google Sheets, PDF document, or web page while you're calculating something at the same time. Jumping into advanced settings, you can turn on adaptive battery optimization, as well as for display properties. This is where you can change options including a standard mode versus a creator mode. If you flick this on, it will increase the color gamut to display 10-bit color, as well as upscale to HDR for compatible content, giving it even more pop. Other options include changing the white balance manually, making the screen warmer versus cooler, as well as a custom RGB setting, as well as the refresh rate if you want to dial it back to 60 Hz to consume consume less power. And because this is a OLED display, you can also turn on an always-on display mode that of course will consume a little bit more power. But if we wanted to activate this functionality and kind of flick off the screen, you'll see just some basic information display like the time, as well as check out any incoming calls, notifications at a glance, maybe just a little bit more easily. And so it's not surprising that everything still feels quite modern. There is absolutely no app from the Google Play Store that you aren't able to install and run just fine on this device's hardware. Furthermore, the taller aspect ratio of the screen actually makes it a joy to use when you're reading things like, for example, webtoons. You're just able to see a little bit more of the screen before you have to scroll up and down again. So it definitely has its advantages when it comes to certain type of content, including video, that you are consuming on the device. That being said, of course, there are still other edge cases. Perhaps if you're looking at more boxy content or for unoptimized apps, it can of course have a little bit more of letterboxing going on. But overall, it's not that bad and surprisingly still feels like a pretty enjoyable experience, even if you're used to a more traditional, wider aspect ratio for the display. And again, running third-party apps, whether it's gaming or social media, still feels surprisingly fast and robust on this phone. In fact, they even give you a version of Call of Duty pre-installed, and to leverage the once flagship CPU and GPU power inside, that has held up incredibly well. I've always thought that the Snapdragon 855, 865 era were ahead of their time because the phones had really consistent thermal performance, never really got too hot, unlike the Snapdragon 888, and to some extent the 8 Gen 1 also had the same problem because they were, again, ironically enough, manufactured on Samsung's fabrication facilities instead of TSMC. So in some ways, it's highly ironic because if you're looking at a Snapdragon 865 generation phone like this Xperia 5 Mark II, the performance is excellent. However, the display is crippled by Samsung's unfortunate manufacturing QA. And then you go to a newer gen phone like the Snapdragon 888 8 Gen 1, released in 2021, and maybe the display problem has been fixed. However, then the processor starts to overheat because it was manufactured by Samsung, which continues to be a point of contention on Google Pixel's Tensor chips. So it is kind of funny that they have messed up an entire generation, the entire industry in a way, because of these QA problems. But because when you're picking up the phone, the display as well as the processor obviously don't have any labels that you can see directly on the outside, they're just kind of getting off the hook naturally because people don't really realize all these components were made by Samsung, which is, again, unfortunate, I think, for some of their partners that they've worked with, since in this case, the Xperia 5 Mark II is still an excellent performing phone, even now almost 5 years later, which is incredible. However, it is kind of just ruined by this display issue. I mean, yes, if you're looking at a device maybe just as a backup phone, and you're okay with this visual defect, you might be able to snatch one up at a very low cost. But obviously, it's far from the ideal situation and can be quite distracting if you really are consuming lots of content and video with it. So there we have it, kind of an unfortunate conclusion that we draw to, but I think for an average consumer, because of this particular flaw, I probably wouldn't necessarily recommend you rush out and get one of these phones. More so, it's bringing to light one of these manufacturing defects that I think not enough people probably are aware of outside of Sony enthusiasts and online in certain forums on Reddit, which is also why I wanted to share this longer term kind of update video as well. But in some ways, when it comes to the core experience, performance, the fluidity of the phone, I am kind of surprised at how well this phone has held up. It definitely feels like more than only 1 year apart compared to the original Xperia 1 and Xperia 5. This feels like more of a significant generational leap forward. But anyways, you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. And again, I will always be a fan of Sony devices just for their quirkiness, as well as ultimately still rooting for Samsung despite for all of their issues, let's say, but hopefully with improved quality control. Thanks for watching. Here at OS Reviews, that's been a revisited look back at the Sony Xperia 5 Mark II.